Well, welcome guys. Welcome to Mr. Falvo's virtual classroom, our virtual classroom, I should say. I tried to recreate our classroom. I posted this a couple weeks ago in Google Classroom. I don't know if you saw it, had a chance to view it, but I tried to recreate our classroom. There's the quote I have outside my classroom door, the smart board, that table that I have, me, my bit emoji, and the subjects I teach, and a little message from me on the blackboard in the back. That was history and sociology classroom. Miss you all, which is true. I do miss you all. And then we have the Marie Antoinettes in the back, because I had my world history students draw crazy hairstyles of Marie Antoinette, and those are in the back of my classroom, and the table groups, and then of course me. But anyways, today we're going to talk about sexuality. Look at this graph. Tell me what this graph means. Okay, so if he answered that, this graph indicates or shows that the percentage of U.S. adults that favor same-sex marriage has increased, has went up, while the percentage of adults that oppose same-sex marriage went down, and that is true. Over the period of a few years, has very transformed opinion in the United States. So this idea of sexuality used to be more conservative, but especially since the Supreme Court ruling in 2015 making gay marriage the law of the land, more people have become accepting of it. So, little quick history of sexuality. So, why are we talking about sexuality? Because people tend to mix up sexuality and gender. So, in Gender Revolution, there's a great quote that I love. Gender is who you go to bed as, and sexuality is who you go to bed with. So that's a very important distinction to understand the difference. So Puritans, if you remember them from American history, in the early 1600s, they were a very conservative group of um, Christians who left the Church of England for religious freedom. They wanted strict social conformity. So they preached the correct sexuality, limiting sex to only reproduction within marriage. So that was the only case you could engage in that type of activity. And if you disobey that, so if you did not conform to the social norms established in Puritan culture, you would be punished, even if it was done in the privacy of your own home, if they found out, of course. So this very conservative notion of sexuality persisted throughout American history for about 300 years, and then in the Roaring 20s, kind of with the idea of the flappers, that kind of sped thing, and that kind of transformed this idea of sexuality. Again, I'm just trying to go through this very quickly. Alfred Kinsley, he was a social scientist, and he began what is now the sexual revolution. But people were mad at Kinsley. They were like, why are you studying the sexuality? You're ruining the moral fabric of our country. And in the 60s, people picked up with these thoughts from Kinsley, and they already came to change what sexuality was in the United States, and kind of changed our culture. And what sexuality should be. So it became more small L, liberal. So what was I going to say? So let me go back here. So let me define sexual orientation. So sexual orientation is a person's sexual identity in relation to gender to the gender they are attracted. The fact that they are heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, and sexuality is viewed as a person's capacity for sexual feeling. These are usually governed by norms and values of society. Remember my favorite word, they're governed by culture, which are influenced by the agents of socialization. So remember the agents of socialization: school, mass media, peer groups, family, religion. So this idea of sexuality in society are governed by our culture, which are, and that way that is communicated to us by our social norms. The reason why I went through a quick history of sexuality is because this idea of sexuality has changed over time. And I just wanted to show you a list of different sexualities. People tend to think of the main ones: heterosexual being straight, homosexual being gay, bisexual, liking both men and women. So there are multiple ones. There's lesbian, of course, gay, just being fluid. So that means you're not restricted to either being gay or lesbian. So also demisexual as well, meaning that you only build sexual feelings after building a romantic or emotional relationship with a person. So there are a variety, or pansexual, pansexual as well. I'm not going to go through all the different sexualities because I do want to show a TED Talk. So picking up with the history of the gay rights movement, because when we talk about sexuality, I'm going to talk about that. So being gay in until the 1970s was diagnosed as a mental disorder. We talked about this during gay conversion therapy. I showed you guys a video about that. I don't know if you remember that. So many states had laws on the books criticizing homosexuality, the Lavender Scare. So gays were actually forbidden, and gay people were actually forbidden to serve in the federal government during the Cold War, because it was thought that gay people were communists. And it wasn't until 2003 when the Supreme Court struck down laws criminalizing same-sex interactions. In 2015, the Supreme Court declared same-sex marriage equality the law of the land in a 5-4 decision. So the reason why I'm telling you about this is this: our idea of sexuality in our culture is being changed as we speak. And the LGBTQ community as a whole is a subculture. So you have pride parades, gay neighborhoods and communities such as West Hollywood, where over 50% of the population identifies as gay, lesbian, etc. Hell's Kitchen in New York City, Chelsea, Provincetown, etc. But that's changing in our Western culture, because throughout the world, places in such as some Middle Eastern countries, with the exception of Israel, and some African countries, homosexuality is illegal. And for men, you can actually be put to death for that. And with that, we're going to go right to the TED Talk. So you're going to answer these questions. So let me go to the video right here. So he's going to talk more about sexuality.
disturbing footage was leaked. It's going viral.
What I want to do with you today is to share some ideas, some speculative ideas about the future evolution of human sexuality. And my starting point is that, as we all know, in Western societies, although certainly not in many non-Western societies, there is ever greater acceptance of LGBT rights and sexuality. We've gone to a much better place in terms of understanding the human rights and dignity of LGBT people. And so what I want to ask is, if this trend continues towards ever greater acceptance of LGBT people, what will it mean for the future? Where will this lead us in the end? Because we know that human culture evolves and that human sexuality is part of culture, and therefore it too is evolving and will evolve in the future. My starting point, I guess, is that if we move towards a more post-homophobic society where human sexuality is no longer an issue, how will that transition to equality, dignity, and respect? How will that affect the expression of human sexuality? If we move to a sexually enlightened society where there is acceptance of diversity, what would this mean for the future expression of same-sex identity and sexuality? Now, we already know, thanks to a host of different sex surveys, that bisexuality is a fact of life, and that a significant and growing proportion of the population are open to both opposite sex and same-sex attraction. If that is the case, then where will this lead us? If we go back in time in history, we know that Dr. Alfred Kinsey in the United States in the 1940s, he was the first person to give major statistical evidence that the categories of gay and straight are not watertight and mutually exclusive. He discovered that for many people, sexuality is a continuum between people who are 100% heterosexual and those who are 100% homosexual. A lot of people, he found, are to varying degrees somewhere in the middle, a mixture, an amalgam of different sexual desires and attractions.
So what he means by, what Peter means by a continuum is, let me draw something for you.
Now, these, of course, may or may not be acted upon, but in his respondents, he found high levels of both opposite sex and same-sex attraction in significant proportions of the many thousands of men.
So this is what he means by a continuum. So basically, one end, you have 100% straight or heterosexual and 100% gay, homosexual on one side. And he's saying most people identify somewhere in the middle, and that is basically fluid. So you could be, different people are in different spots on the continuum.
And women that he interviewed. An observer poll here in Britain just 3 or 4 years ago found this greater trend towards sexual experimentation as homophobic attitudes decline. It found that of 16 to 24-year-olds, 23% had had a same-sex experience, much higher than the national average and much, much higher than in years and decades past. And so that would indicate to me that already a lot of young people, a significant portion of young people, are recognizing their capacity for both hetero and homo desire. This was something that's also been documented by anthropologists. I'm a great fan of Helen Ford and Frank Beach, who wrote a book called Patterns of Sexual Behavior, published in Britain in the 1960s. It was the result of a surveys of tribal societies, pre-capitalist societies, mostly in Asia, Africa, the Caribbean, and parts of the Middle East. And they found that of those 76 societies that they researched or took research from, they found that homosexuality was considered normal and acceptable in 49. That's nearly 2/3 of those societies surveyed from the 1920s to the 1950s. They also recorded that in some Aboriginal cultures, such as the Karahi and Sambia in Papua New Guinea, all young men entered into a same-sex relationship with an older unmarried warrior as part of their rites of passage into manhood. The older warrior taught them the skills of hunting and other manly activities, and that was allied with a sexual relationship. But once completed, those young men ceased to have homosexual contact and went on to marry. In other words, they went through a phase or a period of homosexuality where they were sexually functional with another male, but then resumed what we might call the traditional heterosexual marriage path for the rest of their lives. And Colin Ford and Frank Beach and others have concluded this would indicate that human sexuality is much more malleable than many of us acknowledge.
So by malleable, he means like flexible, right? The instance that he was giving with the different cultures. So young men had these sexual relationships with these older warriors, a mentor and sexual relationship. But when they were done, but once they transitioned into manhood, they stopped having these relationships with those older warriors. So it begs the question, is there a continuum like Peter is saying, or is it just you're gay, you're straight, whatever? So that's a very interesting question that Peter is bringing up.
That there's a cultural element in terms of expectations and mores that influences the expression of human sexuality. They said that if sexual orientation was...
Remember, mores are basically like our social norms, significant social norms. We talked about that at the beginning of the semester.
Pre-programmed at birth, if it was biologically fixed, it would not be possible for people to be bisexual, or in the case of the Papua New Guinean tribes, to switch from one sexual attraction to another with such apparent ease. So Colin Ford and Frank Beach concluded that heterosexuality, bisexuality, and homosexuality are fundamental to the human species. They are part of the natural spectrum of human sexual desire and attraction, and that they're very substantially influenced by cultural mores and expectations. So this leads me to conclude that if culture changes in our society, surely manifestations of sexuality will also change over time. The crossover between hetero and homo, I think, will become more commonplace. And of course, we are talking about conscious desires. As we know from psychology, many people have hidden unconscious desires that they don't acknowledge or accept. So maybe if we reached a state where it didn't matter who was gay or straight, that sexual orientation was no longer an issue, maybe those people could bring those feelings to the surface that they've hidden and repressed.
That's a very interesting question to think about.
So this is a picture of human sexuality, which is much more complex, diverse, blurred, and so on, than the traditional simplistic binary image of hetero and homo, which of course is not only loved by many straight moralists, but even held to by many lesbians and gay men. My view is that if sexual orientation has at least an element, perhaps not an entire determination, but an element of indeterminacy and flexibility based on culture, then surely the present forms of heterosexuality and homosexuality are conditional, that they are not likely to remain the same in perpetuity, and as culture changes, so will expressions of sexuality. In a future non-homophobic society, as the taboos around same-sex relations recede, I suspect, as the Observer poll indicated, that many more people are likely to have gay sex and relationships, even if perhaps only temporarily or experimentally. Interestingly, of course, the demise of homophobia is likely to make redundant the need to assert and affirm one's LGBT identity. In my view and my experience and my study of history, gay and lesbian identities are largely the product of homophobic prejudice and repression. They are a self-defense mechanism against homophobia, biphobia, and transphobia. So faced with
he's basically saying that, I'm going to stop it here because I think I might be running over time. He's basically saying that, okay, so people identify as gay, bisexual, lesbian, because they feel kind of like it's becoming attacked. They might be, okay, they might be discriminated against, so like identifying as a part of a larger community kind of gives them like a sense of belonging because they're straying away from the social norm of heterosexuality. If that makes sense. If that doesn't make sense, make sure to mention that in the response. So I'm going to give you your exit ticket and take care, guys.